Mind will be blown by this. We live in the middle of nowhere. We don't even have deliveries. Whenever we go to a city, he's like, can we get the food delivered? Anyway, so we shall move on, and I shall invite up for the Wayve panel. Please welcome from Gowling WLG, Matt Hervey. From Wayve, Dr. Sarah Gates. From ASDA, James Barge. From University of Warwick, Dr. Siddhartha Kastkir. And to chair this panel from Form Ventures, Andrew Bennett. If you want to come join us on the stage. We shall get on with the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining the panel, where we'll be discussing the role of autonomous vehicle deliveries in London and how we can pave the way towards them. I'm delighted to introduce an excellent panel from closest to me. We're starting with Dr. Siddhartha Kastkir, who's Head of Verification and Validation of Connected AVs at the University of Warwick. Sarah Gates from Wayve, who's Director of Public Policy there. James Barge, who's Director of Public Affairs at ASDA, and Matt Hervey, who's Head of Artificial Intelligence Law at Gowling WLG. The aim of this panel is really to kind of explore how AVs fit into the future of last-mile deliveries. Already, freight vehicles account for a fifth of all kilometres driven in many cities, and Transport for London in London anticipates that this could increase to 26% by 2040. So we're really going to understand what role the AVs have in terms of greater utilisation, how they can help change the cities, the impact on congestion, and a whole load of questions around the feasibility of the technologies, the marketability, and regulation as well. So it's an excellent panel that we have to dig into this. I just want to ask a quick question of the audience. Can we have a show of hands for who is here from an AV company or a company that's kind of working adjacent to AVs? Okay. And who is here from industry who may be looking to use AVs in the future or is interested in their application in their sector? Okay. And who is here from government or regulators? Okay, excellent. So you know who to target your answers at. Maybe kind of to kick off, I think it'd be great to ground today's discussion in just kind of understanding the near-term and the long-term realities of where AVs are at, both in terms of personal ownership and in terms of fleet deployment. And Sarah, I want to kind of come to you first on this. Can you talk us through the practicalities, whether it's the sort of safety, some of the constraints around testing at the moment, retrofitting, just what does the reality of AVs look like at the moment?
Yeah, cool. Thank you. So thanks for having me here today. So I'm Sarah Gates, Head of Public Policy at Wayve, and I'll just do a quick intro to Wayve to start, because not everyone in the audience might have heard of Wayve before. So we're currently based in King's Cross, and we've got around 200 employees there. That's our HQ, and we're building level 4, or fully driverless, or what we will call in the UK, no user in charge, automated driving system for fully driverless deployments. So we are currently in development. We started Wayve in 2017, so we've been testing on public roads in London since 2019. And the kind of, I guess I would say the current sort of challenges we have around testing are very few. So we're lucky to be in the UK that has a very progressive regulatory framework for testing, and that's been really helpful for companies like Wayve to come here and have the freedom to develop this really complex technology. We've also had really good developments this year with the proposals from the Law Commission that Connor discussed earlier, so really clear sort of legislative framework and how we're going to think about the new legal actors that we need to deploy. And ultimately, we need our partners. So ASDA and Ocado trials will be starting in the next 6 months, which we're really excited about. So that will start us on the path to learning the really, really challenging aspects of beyond building the ADS itself and integrating it into vehicles, which is complicated enough. We'll have to work out how do you actually run a service? How do you get goods to customers? What do those customers think of that? And beyond that, we also have to work out how do we prove to the regulator that the L4 technology is safe. So there are definitely a lot of challenges and a lot of questions still to answer, but I feel like at Wayve, we're in a really good position and a good path at the moment where we're trying to break down each of those big challenges through our partnerships to start to answer some of those really challenging questions.
That's a really, really helpful overview. And Siddhartha, if we can come to you next. Just interested in how you would think about some of the sort of constraints that we are placing at the moment on testing and how over the long term we'll be able to kind of get to that more generalizable model.
I think, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Siddharth Kastagi, lead the verification and validation research at WMG. So I think the first thing we need to appreciate here is that we're not going to have a fully autonomous system tomorrow. That's not going to happen. That's the reality of the world right now. We'll also have a gradual rollout of these systems. When I say gradual, it could be gradual in terms of level 4 in constrained ODDs, or gradual in terms of the traditional manufacturers doing it L2, L3, and L4. So there are two ways of looking at a gradual rollout. A company like Wayve, who are focused on L4 systems, they'll start off with a constrained ODD, and that's what they've been focusing on. And I think that's a very pragmatic approach to rolling out L4 driving. Any organization that says that we're going to do the whole country or a whole city is not very serious or may not have the right safety culture. So the rollout would be initially in constrained, what we call as operational design domains, ODDs. But it's important to also appreciate that when you try and define safety, you're not going to or should not claim that your system is absolutely safe. The concept of absolute safety is a myth. What you should claim is what your system can and cannot do. So the ODDs in which you can work and the ODDs in which you cannot work. It's very important to highlight those concepts. And I think some of the organizations in the UK like Wayve and others are actually taking that approach, which sounds really well, keeping the technology developing, but also keeping the society safe.
I think that's a really important kind of distinction, as you say. And so, I mean, maybe Luke, it'd just be interesting to hear, obviously, Sarah mentioned the trial that is forthcoming. How are you thinking about the sort of feasibility of AVs in terms of the existing journeys that ASDA is already doing, the influence of the road network? You know, I'm sure we'll come on to it, but do you anticipate any need to change infrastructure over the long term, or is that not going to be a concern?
Yeah, I mean, also thanks for having me today. I mean, if I set the context from our standpoint, ASDA makes about 37.5 million home deliveries a year. That's just under 3 million a month, 700,000 a week. 4% of those take place in London, and we saw exponential growth, obviously, through the COVID pandemic in particular. So for us, for all the reasons that Sarah and Siddhartha have set out, this is very much a long-term ambition to grow our position in the market. But it's also a really key area for us to be able to drive efficiencies, both from a customer standpoint and from a business standpoint. At the same time, looking at our fleet of around 3,500 vehicles as it currently stands, we're also looking to move them across and push them towards being a more largely EV fleet than they are now. And there'll be synergies between this process and that process that we can look to make further efficiencies in. So in the long run, I'd say that some of the barriers that both Sarah and Siddhartha have very much set out already, we're very much aware of, but our partnership with Wayve is critical to us in understanding how we work through those. And as I say, we're committed to a long-term ambition to meet almost all of those deliveries, if not all of them, through an autonomous fleet.
Okay, there's the ambition. Matt, if we can kind of hear from you a little bit about, be interested to learn more about, the detail. You start to mention talking about what a system can and cannot do, what that means in terms of safety standards and the way that kind of law treats these sort of emerging areas of technology.
Yeah, I mean, you say emerging areas in the law. I mean, the thing that really has to be emphasised repeatedly is the Law Commission for the first time has been asked to propose new legislation, not merely to look at existing legislation with a massive body of evidence and experience, and then propose reforms. I mean, my bread and butter is the Patents Act, which was written before many of us were born, and we still are reinterpreting it. So what we're trying to do is to come together with regulation and law and the technology simultaneously while the business case may change, while liability issues may change. So I think the Law Commission's work is a phenomenal product, and I'm very glad to see that the government intends to follow those proposals. I think, however, there is significant work to be done. The first is political, and I would say that engages two issues. One is ultimate liability. So we have the AVE Act in place, we have the first line of insurance, but then we have ultimate liability. And I think it is a question for government as to whether this is an area of activity which will stimulate growth and make us a net exporter of technology. And we've heard today how much big tech has been investing every month for 10 years, and whether there is a case for further protection of liability. The Law Commission's proposals create a very thorough framework which should erode the liability for negligence and product liability, but beyond that, there's still work to be done. I think the other issue is trust, and particularly equality. So it is inevitable, I think, that any new system will change the risk across the population. Now, hopefully it will be safer for everyone, and collisions, fatalities, etc. will be lower for everyone, but proportionally it may move the dial. And at the moment, there are requirements for companies to give equality impact statements which will present that issue, and it's a political issue, but it's a decision that we need to support as a society, and that requires real work from central government. I think the other critical issue is primary legislation to actually unlock, first of all, driverless vehicles, and secondly, the mechanisms for the secondary legislation. And if we are right that VCA and others will be ready with the detail by 25 and the technology will be ready at the same time, it would be embarrassing, to say the least, to have primary legislation being the barrier at that point. And then I would identify two other areas I think need work which are outside of the remit of what's been done. Mm-hmm. And the first is data sharing and privacy, how those balances are in fact going to get struck, and further work is needed there. And the second is intellectual property. This is an area that relies disproportionately on trade secrets, and disclosure is antimatter to trade secrets, and we need to make sure what is being disclosed is actually useful, and that there should be layers of confidentiality in initial stages of disclosure to regulators.
So I just want to pick on something. I mean, that last point I think links back to the point you made around winning the political argument and kind of securing public trust. And Sarah, from Wave's point of view, you know, there's a whole load of conversations around AVs and the sort of expectation that some companies or people, or the criticism that some people lay at some companies around the need to change road infrastructure, or you know, changes that we have to make to society in order to make AVs work. But that doesn't seem to be the way that Wayve are going about things. Could you just kind of talk a little bit about, you know, winning that long-term kind of political and public trust argument and barriers to that?
Yeah, I think we're always really glad to have the opportunity to sort of refute the claims that AVs are going to require people to wear certain kind of markings or hats or beacons, or fundamentally change our road layouts. So Wave's approach to building ADS is based on AI and data. It learns every day from the world around it. And that means it's learning from the world we have today. So we don't change that world for that AV to drive safely. And it's really important that we communicate that. It's a really big part of how we'll get people on board. I feel optimistic about the challenge of public trust. I think it was mentioned in an earlier panel. People want convenience, and they want a service that works, that brings them something that they need, that they want. And if an AV or autonomous technology built into Asda services mean that people can have more on-demand grocery delivery, then they are more willing or more likely to accept that technology in their lives. And especially if we're not requiring them to fundamentally change anything they do. Of course, in the long run, when AVs become more widespread, we might actually get changes to our road layout that we welcome. So we might be able to have fewer car parking spaces and free up thousands of hectares of land across the country and in London to actually allow us to have more green space. And of course, that is a great impact that would mean we can have more parks or more space for cycle lanes and walking. And so I think it's always important to think about the cumulative effects of safety and impacts on the environment of autonomous technology. It's not only the vehicles themselves, but if it allows people to feel more free in the kind of walking and cycling in their cities, then we ultimately could end up with more vehicles on the road and people living healthier lives. So I think it's really important to always think about the benefits of people, and that's very much something that we do at Wayve. We're not building this technology for the sake of it, we're building this technology to introduce it into services that ultimately make people's lives better.
Yeah, and so kind of to build on that, I mean, Luke, obviously Asda serves a whole range of different customers, and in terms of we've talked about user needs, we've talked about kind of society's needs, and the infrastructure that society builds is a sort of reflection of those needs. How do you think, when you think about the AV opportunity for fleet operators, how will those user needs differ between kind of different companies and the different kind of customers that you have?
Well, my parents nearly called me Luke, but I went with James.
Oh,
That's all right.
apologies.
No, it's all right. It's fine. It's fine.
I've written Luke 3 times on my notes.
So
Apologies.
You should have obviously been speaking to my dad, but my mum went out. So, I mean, you touch on the point when it comes, there are multiple different reasons that people use our home delivery. Some don't want to or can't be bothered to go to our stores. And that particular, we haven't seen everyone return to stores, particularly post-COVID. They're just not comfortable in that space. For some, it's a genuine lifeline. So they may have kids that have special needs or would not thrive in our store environments despite the quiet hours and everything else we have. So I think the way we're looking at this, as I say, we're at the very early stages of this, and I want to stress when I mentioned efficiencies earlier, that is not code for saying we need fewer people. What it may mean is that we need the same people doing different jobs. And part of that may well be that there is still someone attending in order to provide the service that our customers expect from us. We're approaching this not just from an operations standpoint, as I said, but also from what does the customer experience look like. And there are different expectations depending on if they've got a 3.5-ton van stood at the end of their driveway, or as if they've got one of our third-party partners bringing them something that they've forgotten on a same-day fulfillment basis. So I think from a customer standpoint, what we envisage at the moment is that to your point, that there will be different models for different deliveries. What that looks like at the moment, as I say, we have to go on this journey with our customers as well to understand what those expectations look like. But we're not doing this purely for the sake of let's tick that box of efficiency for saving's sake. We need to make it work.
And Sadada, if that's kind of the example of, or that's the experience of one company, if we think about the general public as a whole, how do you see the sort of case for AVs and building up a trust? How is that developing currently? If you take us through what research has been done in this area already, and what sort of barriers there might be to address.
I think it's a brilliant question. I think it's often forgotten, the end user when it comes to technology. The success of the self-driving technology or automated technology is going to be dependent on us thinking of this as a system where people are part of the system, and technology is one aspect of the system. We more or less mostly focus on just getting the self-driving tech as a most safe or most fancy self-driving tech that's possible. That's not going to cut it for us as an ecosystem. So it's very important to take a systems approach where the end user is part of this design, and that's where when you're creating those services, you're creating services what people want. And when you do that, then you get a much higher rate of acceptance and trust building aspect in this area. CCAV, Center for Connected Autonomous Vehicles, have done some fantastic work recently around social behavior research. So one of the things that our research has previously shown is the more you get people to experience this technology, even if it's at a trial mode, the more trust that you can develop in them. So there's a big piece of work that's happening right now as we speak on social behavior research, and I think that might be continued in the following years also. So that is a big aspect of the research. It's not just the tech, it's also the people involved, and I think that's why developers like Wayve working with the end users at Asta and Ocado is very important, because the whole system has to be safe. You can't just have the tech from Wayve safe, whereas the delivery services are not done in the right manner.
I think that's a great kind of insight in terms of, as you say, kind of building that public case. And Matt, you were talking about there's a risk that maybe we don't have primary legislation by the time that some of the more technical regulatory work has been done. To what extent do you think that's because, at the moment there doesn't seem to be, it's maybe not a doorstep issue, the legalization or the sort of new legal actors that we need around AVs. To what extent do you think that trust or that public awareness the lack of that has led to maybe this maybe not being as much of a priority on the primary legislation side?
Well, I mean, my day-to-day is dealing with laws once they've been passed, so that's maybe a policy question more for Sarah. But what I would certainly say is, as a lawyer looking at what's going through with artificial intelligence in general, because my expertise is cross-sector for this, there are so many competing requirements to regulate AI, and it is an area where the skills base is thin on the ground. And the government has said that it doesn't intend to engage particularly in cross-cutting regulation, and it will look at sector-by-sector requirements. And the Turing has done a research into our bandwidth. And for my money, we need to focus on high return propositions where without regulation you can't actually do things. And for me, that's automotive and life sciences. And so I hope that's where the focus will be politically in terms of priority.
And do you think that you talked about the kind of the different sectoral approach. Is there a risk of not aligning between the different work that's going on in government around, creating, ambiguous frameworks that don't kind of serve the need that we're talking about here today?
I think the benefit flows the other way generally. I think proof of safety in this field will have learnings for all sorts of fields, and I think it's a really valuable test case for that. I've already alluded to, I think, the two big crossovers, which is GDPR, so privacy, data sharing, IP. Those are all, I think, areas where we need to join up the dots for this sector to make sure that what they're doing is clearly mandated and required, so they're safe when it comes to privacy and other issues. So that's where you have overlapping concerns. And that said, any of this is going to require all manner of employment law and competition law. There's so many pre-existing issues, let alone the regulation, that needs to be worked through. So the government does need to hurry up.
So, Sarah, you have an interesting role at the sort of frontier of this sector and thinking through these different policy challenges. Where do you see, it'd be helpful if you could take us through the work that's already been done by the UK government on this sector, on this issue, but then, as kind of Matt set out, what needs to happen going forwards?
Yeah, I think Matt's been making my policy ask to government very clear. The lobbying's working. So there's been loads of work done by UK government, and I think, I referenced the progressive testing framework earlier, so I think that followed a review in around 2015 by DFT, looking into, what actually were the rules and regulations around testing an autonomous vehicle on our roads. And I think, it's fair to say it was sort of a grey area that meant they could leave the code of practice very open. So the code of practice was originally developed in 2015, around the same time that the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles was set up. So there's been a lot of support from the UK government, but, I think it's fair to say since about 2016 in the UK, there's been a decent amount of distraction. So any emerging technology that needs sustained policy and political interest is going to suffer from a sort of turbulent political situation where, as you say, it's not exactly a doorstep issue. It's something that is always going to be, pitted against health, immigration, education, and, which are huge, really important issues, right, and much more live. And we have a government at the minute that it's very fashionable to talk about deregulation, because there's always, well, as far as I've been working in policy, there's always been this myth around innovation and regulation being against each other, which I think anyone who actually works in the fields would, there's always a bad regulation, right? But innovation needs regulation a lot of the time, and AVs, as Matt said, is a perfect example. We need that regulation to be able to remove the driver, to create, the liability regime, or even start to create the liability regime through primary legislation that allows us to put these vehicles on the road, safely. And we really should do that soon, because there's always the chance in this grey area that sort of the lack of clarity around road traffic legislation has allowed is you could get a company that comes along and decides that they're just going to put a vehicle on the road without a driver. Wayve has no intentions to do that, but there's technically nothing stopping us, and that would be really damaging for the industry in the UK and any other country that happened in, and it would hurt all other industry actors.
So if that's the kind of political or policy timeline, I think it'd be interesting to see how that then matches up with the market timeline, the technological timeline as well. I mean, Luke, I've done that again. This is why you don't write notes beforehand.
Luke.
Let's just go with it.
Yeah. You should never prepare for a panel.
Yeah, that's fine.
Apologies. James,
I'll
be interested to ask you a question at this point.
Just this once.
No, but I am interested in the sort of, we've talked a little bit about the AV opportunity for fleet operators, but I mean, you're one of the interesting ones that's already thinking about trialing this. I'm interested to hear what you'll be looking for as part of that trial, how you'll be managing risks as part of it, and you know, what are the lessons that other companies thinking about doing this might be looking to see how you go about it to learn.
I mean, in some ways, I think I could, if that question could go to Sarah as well, because I think, look, from our standpoint, exactly, it's good, and my alter ego could answer this on my behalf, but I'll go for it. Look, from our side, we're really clear that we're not experts in this space. What we are quite good at is understanding our sector and online delivery. And I think that's where the synergy between Wayve and Asda exists, right? Where we can very quickly upskill and say, look, this is what our customers expect, this is what we know works, and this is how we know it works. It's really up to Wayve's pathway and then a little bit of systems changes at our end, partly driven through this trial, partly driven through our separation from Walmart, where we can begin to then drive forward together quite quickly. But it's not really an answer to your question, I recognise, but the expertise doesn't sit at our end when it comes to this.
Well, I mean, maybe that's a good time to come to Sarah. Like, when you are trialing, whether it's with Asda, whether it's more broadly, what are the things that you're kind of particularly looking for, and what are the, you know, if you have a roadmap of what has to exist to get to that kind of AV 2.0 point, what are the things that you're, you know, prioritizing over the course of that development?
A lot of things. Yeah, there is lots to learn. I think, yeah, it really is a transformation, right, of how you deliver these services, not an evolution. So we obviously have lots of super smart people in Wayve who are beavering away, building the machine learning to build our end-to-end machine learning-based AV technology, which is a big challenge in itself, and you know how we'll integrate that into different vehicle types. But in terms of, you know, really integrating it into a service like Asda's, you've actually got so there is the sort of end user delivery point, which in itself, there's still lots of questions there. You know, will there be a driver? Will there be a person in the vehicle who actually has quite a different role? Will there also be some deliveries that arrive with no driver or no customer service agent? And how will the person get the groceries out of the van? And ultimately, I don't think, you know, just like Asda are not the ADS experts, Wayve are not the experts to answer those questions either. They're not our customers, and any fleet partner and partner that we work with, you know, it's their users and their demand that will inform that. But there is a lot of learning that Wayve, you know, will have to collaborate with partners on, particularly for fleet ownership, around, well, how do you actually deploy a level 4 or no user in charge fleet and look after it? Who manages it? Who cleans the cameras, the sensors? Who ensures that the vehicles are safe? So we go through a huge process to convince the vehicle certification agency that the vehicles should be on the road, they're safe enough. But then how do you actually manage that fleet? Do we have the skills in the UK to manage fleets? There's a huge amount of learning. So I think Connor mentioned earlier, there'll be a new Newark operator. We don't currently have anyone in the UK who knows how to be a Newark operator. You know, that could be a company like Wayve to begin with, but ultimately we will see you know, the creation of lots of new companies that will come in to fill the gaps in this market with these really specialist skills that don't exist yet. So, you know, we don't yet have an operating manual for how to manage a Wayve ADS on the road in a fleet. So when we start our trials this year and ultimately have more and more trials, we'll be looking to answer more of those questions.
There's I think, something quite exciting there about you know, you have this total transformation across a whole range of different variables, and I know that one of the key issues of today's conference is around congestion, and that's certainly one of the issues that AVs can help solve. I'd be interested to hear how when you put together the net effect of, higher utilization, but ultimately reduced vehicle numbers, reduced manufacturing emissions of potentially having fewer cars, how does that kind of net out on what it means for the city? I mean, Siddhartha, maybe it'd be good to come to you first on that one.
I think I'll go back to this concept of having a systems approach to things. And I'll give you a very small example. So assuming all these automated vehicles would be electric, does the UK electric infrastructure, grid infrastructure, have the capacity to actually charge these systems? And the answer is, to be very honest, in the London area, no. So we don't have that. So we can have a very safe self-driving fleet which is completely electric, but with the high utilization, we don't have the charging infrastructure to be able to charge them. So we can't just look at it just from a single tech perspective. It has to be looked at from a systems perspective. When you talk about congestion, there are multiple aspects involved in it. So, for example, the local authorities will need to get involved from the infrastructure perspective. If it's on the strategic road network, national highways will need to get involved. So I think those conversations are not yet happening in the UK, but they need to happen. So a point that Matt was mentioning around the learning and the cross-domain things, I think they are siloed right now, but that needs to change if we are actually serious about the proper societal benefit, not just self-driving, but self-driving an electric system, an electric vehicle, which is a fleet, and then the charging infrastructure and the corresponding renewable grid storage also.
That's interesting. So, I mean, from a local government perspective, there's a lot there that has to happen to kind of pave the way for this to happen at a systems level, as you say. I mean, Sarah, when you think about, we talked previously about sort of regulatory piece in terms of central government, but if you think about a city like London, how can government help support the transition of these sort of cities to a world of AVs, particularly when they're being used for example, last mile delivery, given how many kilometres of road journey that those journeys take up?
Yeah, so I think there's actually a lot for central government to do in this space. We were talking about the e-bikes and licensing kind of between different boroughs, but I actually think in the context of AVs, that licensing will be a new licensing regime for Newark operation, and that will have to come from central government. And, I would expect that would be something that you might give to a company like Wayve or the future Newark operator to operate within its operational design domain, but also within that probably an operational domain, which could be a borough or multiple boroughs for initial deployments. So I think most of the legislation would come from a central government point of view, but ultimately, at a constituency level, council level, that's going to be driven by whether people in those places that live there accept that. So from a purely kind of legal point of view, there was a lot of work to be done from the primary legislative and central government viewpoint, but there's going to need to be that join up with councils and local bodies to ensure that people's views are being heard. I mean, I certainly in the area I live in, London, transport is one of the most noisy political issues. I don't know if anyone knows much about low traffic neighbourhoods in London, but it's hugely contentious. So it's not even just about the kind of legal vehicles and legal actors that you need to actually deploy this stuff legally, but you need to do lots of work locally to help people learn about the technology and feel comfortable with it, because ultimately political opinion is driven by public opinion, and if we miss that bit, then you can have all the legislation in the world, but you'll get rejection of the technology.
Well, that sounds like a kind of excellent rallying call. I think that might be our cue to wrap up. So please join me in thank you to the panel for an excellent conversation.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to our Wayve panel.